So let's kick off. So one thing I found in a previous life when I was working for Catapult was the initial asking of the right questions and figuring out what people actually want external load monitoring to do was something that was often left out. So I'm going to come to you, Aaron. What process do we go through to figure out what is the right question and what external load technology potentially can go to answer that question? What's the process people can go through?
Well, first of all, I think you need to understand your sport and the determinants of performance in your sport. And so, are there external load indicators that relate to the performance of your sport? That's for if you're understanding, does external load relate to performance? But the other one, external load, we mostly use it for is in load monitoring is process control. So understanding, what part of the external load or the construct of external load might relate to the processes training that might relate to the performance or fitness outcomes that we're trying to get. So it's a complex question, Rob. You need to understand the underlying mechanisms that underlie performance and how training might relate to those, and what aspects of training load relates to those. Fundamentally, external training load measures what you did. And so did you implement your training plan as intended? And so it's really important that you have a training plan for a start. And so you can measure, did we implement it as we intended to implement it? Because that's where one's part in the training process can break down what we call a training error. Just because you didn't implement training as you intended, or the external load as you intended, doesn't mean it was good or bad. It just means it wasn't as intended. So for me, what you need before you collect any, understand the frameworks that underpin performance and the process of training. But also, really importantly, we probably should have said for a start, talk to a coach and athlete. The coach, they may have their own ideas of what's important, and you can talk to them about that. That might require some education with them, or if not, we're just working with them to deliver the information that they need. There's one thing about being the higher scientific integrity, but it's also about giving the information that you can make actionable decisions from, and the coach needs. So hopefully that made a little bit of sense.
Mm-hmm. Just on the back of that, you simplified it really nicely. It's collecting what information and what you did. Do you think there's a theme that people are actually taking that too far and rely on that too much, and people think that it's actually more than what it is in that simplified state?
Yeah, I agree. We can measure a lot of stuff, a lot of things with external load, and external load is not one measure of it, right? There's many constructs of external load, and you need to understand what thing that's important to your performance that you're measuring. You don't need to measure everything, which many people tend to do, because the devices provide a tsunami of information. And when we first got it, it was really attractive, right? We're trying to understand what relates to something else, and we thought we were really smart with these new metrics and measures. And but you can run a correlation analysis, and everything can come up by random, and you think you found something new every day. But really, what you need to have is what relates back to your training plan. So before you have an external load measure, you need to have a training plan and understand how the external load measure relates to that training plan. Without a training plan, you're not going to get as much usefulness out of your external load monitoring from a monitoring process point of view.
I forgot to mention, excuse me, I forgot to mention at the start, if anyone's got any questions, we'll go for the first 45, 50 minutes, and then we'll dive into the questions that come up in the chat box and the Q&A. But just one more point on this, Aaron, and probably getting into more the granular details. There's 1,000,001 metrics that we can collect. How do we, again, just dialing things down again, how do we go through the process to understand which of the metrics should be collecting?
Well, I'll be very boring here. You need to have things valid for a start. They're measuring what we think they're measuring, but they're reliable. That means that when you measure them the same conditions, they give you the same numbers. They're sensitive in that the things that you're measuring change in response to training. So you can have, I think that's really important: valid, reliable, and sensitive. And really important that you understand actually first principles, what the numbers actually, where they're being derived from and what they mean. There's a lot of derived measures from algorithms that use ratio scores or comparisons of different variables, but you've got to understand what are they actually providing us and how do they relate to either the stimulus that we're trying to provide, or do they relate to the performance requirements? And so deciding what metrics are actionable, I suppose, or what's important, first of all, they've got to be valid, reliable, and they need to relate to performance of the training process. I've said the same thing several times, but I think that is, and it's the fundamentals of athlete monitoring with external load.
I'd love to get Mathieu or Amber to dial in on this one, and just how that's done in a really practical sense, and on the deciding of the right metrics, because you guys are in the thick of it every day. Have you got anything to add there, Mathieu?
First, I wanted to say that I love what Aaron said, that monitoring is not about tech. It's about people, process, and technology. And you need to have perfectly balanced process in between. So if you don't have the good people on board, it won't work. If you don't have the good process, and it's coming through having a training plan to understand what you are doing, it's not going to work. So most of the people are just thinking about, okay, yes, let's dive into external load. I will buy some GPS and everything will be perfect. But to be honest, right now, I would prefer buy some crappy GPS and bring Amber or Ben Simpson on board, rather than have to super expensive GPS, but not understanding the processes that are in the back of it, and do not have the good people in place. Then yes, I think when it's come to selecting the variables, there is two things. We need to think that in the end we are talking with coaches, strength and conditioning coaches, or training coaches, and so we need to select that variables that speak to them, because in the end we will speak to the coaching staff, and we need to keep this number as low as we can. So this is two key things we need to keep in mind. And the third one is that we need to select variables that correspond to some mechanical output or high intensity output. So in the end, it's just about what key variables will be interesting to measure my neuromuscular load. What are the key variables to measure my high intensity output, my top speed one, and my global volume. And if you have this in mind, and that for every single variable you are adding or removing, you are thinking about, okay, what is the physiological process behind that? You will be in a better place to pick the good ones.
Is there often? Oh, were you going to say something, Aaron?
No, I was just going to say, it seems like he's been trained by Martin, right? He's identifying, the training targets that Martin so often measures. So I don't completely agree.
Yeah. Coming to you, Amber. Anything to add?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, like, as you know, when you export out a report from Catapult or any of the other providers, you get a whole sheet of different metrics. And I think it's better, as Mathieu said, to keep it simple, and it's thinking about how you're portraying that information to different audiences. You've got coaches who tend to focus more on the volume, the intensity metrics. That's something that they understand. Whereas you might have a physio who perhaps you can explore a little bit further into some of the different accelerometer metrics or the acceleration, decelerations, that type of thing. So I think it's about understanding what information you're relaying, making it in the simplest way. As Aaron said, it's all about the way that you're portraying those messages for coaches and to different audiences. So I think you can bombard people with information, but the best thing is just to keep it simple.
Is there sometimes a conflict between the things that Aaron said about the reliability and the validity of measures, but what coaches actually understand? And is there sometimes a little bit in between that you might have a little play around with?
I see that's the opportunity, right?
Yep.
There's the opportunity space, right? So
yep.
I use that to educate coaches around, things about measurement precision. Like, it might sound boring, but it's fundamental for coaches to understand that as well. It's a foundation of science and science and evidence-informed practice. So I think that, that like coaches, the ones I work with tend to be pretty open to learning, and they pick it up pretty quick. The concepts aren't that complex, measuring measurement precision, but I think that's a real opportunity to start a conversation. And the more conversations we can have about this with coaches, the better. It makes us more effective, because they're the real decision makers.
Just coming back to you, Mathieu, is for at PSG, is there any key metric? I know we're dumbing things down, and apologies for that, but I think that people may want this kind of information from you guys. What you've gone through that process that we've just talked about for the last 10 minutes. What is the end result for you right now that you're making decisions off?
I think people expect us to do super crazy stuff, but to be honest, we are using super basic metrics, going from total distance to some basic speed in range. So high speed, very high speed. We are using our, let's say, ADI derived mechanical work, which is basically the sum of acceleration, deceleration with an index based on the intensity of the acceleration. Then we have two range for acceleration when the strength and conditioning coaches want to dive in acceleration, deceleration, CODs, but it's mainly when we have specific strength-oriented sessions. And then we are looking at everything related to top speed, number of time in above 90%, top speed reach, percentage of top speed reached during training. So yeah, fairly basic, but it makes the trick. We can have a look at, okay, if it was a speed session, did we reach our objective? If it was a strength session, do we have enough neuromuscular load? If it was more or less high speed, high volume session, high intensity, session, do we reach the good volume? And with that, we are able to come back to the training plan and say, okay, we were in phase with the plan or not, so we need to adjust on that.
Was there a reason? Oh, go on, Aaron.
I just say, Rob, like it's really nice to have these like goals that PSG use, or the metrics that PSG use, but we really need to understand that different sports, different level of sports have different metrics. We really need to be cautious of, saying, these are the perfectly good metrics for PSG to use, but they may not be appropriate for your sport or your level. The first thing you need to do is watch the game, watch the sport, watch how they move, and then relate it back to there, and then you can fit the goals and sessions and etc. But I think it's important for the listeners to understand that.
Yeah, right. Very well said. I don't know if many people knows, but at PSG we have obviously a football team, but as well we have a handball team. And one of the things we've done kind of 2 or 3 years ago, we implement our indoor tracking system, and so we were aiming at more or less duplicating our report for the handball team. But then we have to re-engineer all the reports and rethink carefully about what were the key metrics. And we end up with something like player load being one of the key metrics in handball, because you have less volume of running, but more contact and small movement. And so we have to rethink about that. And so I agree with Aaron that different sports, different demands, different metrics.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was just going to say, I completely agree with that. And having recently just transitioned from football, soccer background to then coming to AFL, looking at the different demands on those two sports and just the way that, even training's conducted, the differences in volumes, the differences in intensities, I completely agree with Aaron. I think for different sports, you have those base foundation of metrics that are identical, but there's kind of little tweaks that you have and different kind of meaningfulness of those metrics within the different sports. So for sure, completely agree.
In that transition, Amber, what was your process? I mean, there was obviously things going on before you got there, but from your understanding and any tweaks that you thought you may want to make, what was that process like for you? What exactly did you go through?
For me, it was just, I guess, getting in that environment of AFL and watching and observing and just seeing the differences that go on. And to be honest with you, I was blown away the first training session that I watched, because their output and their amount of speed was what I'd been seeing only in a couple of the players in a match in soccer in the States. So for me to then see that in a training session, I was almost freaking out, because I was like, I've never seen this high amount of speed across this group of athletes. So for me, it was a whole kind of relearning process and understanding then not only the demands of the sport, but also the individual athletes within that team. And you got, what values I would have thought were high for a certain squad were then a normal for a player within a different team. So I think not only do you need to understand the context of the team and the sport, but also individuals within that and what they can tolerate, what they can do, what they can produce. So for me, it was just like an eye-opening experience. And it was just like that observation and just understanding and being in that environment was the biggest kind of, I guess, transition for me. But as I said, it just blew my mind away.
Cool. Aaron?
It just comes around, a lot of this comes around to the space they move in, how much space is available. And it's like modifying small-sided games in any code. When you get more space, you get more speed, you get more higher distances, more intensity. But then you close in space, you get more collisions, if that's allowed in the sport. And that they're different external load metrics that you use depending on whether you got speed and space. So that sort of fundamentally comes down to the space available and actually the technical skills of the sport and how they move together. So that's why it's really important. First of all, before you look at a device, look at the game.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So just moving on to our next point and coming back to you, Amber, on the planning and periodization. It was one of the questions that came in. There's multiple questions that came in. I've kind of lumped them together into one theme of planning and periodization. And a couple of the questions were how you'd plan a 1-game week versus a 2-game week. I mean, do you have 2-game weeks in AFL, or is it pretty much?
So that's really interesting. Like, I guess I've always worked, with the high performance director who have had that overall plan. So I guess my role has always been more around the data analysis of that plan. As Coutts has said, you have that overall structure. It was actually really interesting this last year. So generally, no, you wouldn't have 2 games a week in AFL. In fact, I think no, you wouldn't. You'd have 1 game a week. But we obviously went into a very different environment with COVID. And so the AFL got transitioned up interstate, so to a different location, and then there was more frequent games played. So we're playing multiple games across a week. So it was an interesting transition because having come from a soccer background where you're obviously regularly playing 2 games a week to then an AFL where it should have been 1 game a week, but then it became multiple games a week. I guess it's just the differences in that is you're just focusing on that recovery element and you're focusing on preparing them for that next stimulus. So rather than a nice, lovely 6-day break between games where you can get your recovery, you can get a main training session, you can get your skills session in, you can get a preparation for the next game, that's all condensed. So I guess your loading midweek takes place of your main training session. And then so you're just focusing in that block in between of recovery, a light touch up, and then you go again into games. But it was really interesting to have that kind of period this year last year gone with COVID, in that was something different to AFL. And also then their games changed as well. The duration of the game changed. They had more kind of rest periods in the game in between goals. So you have those elements which are obviously assisting your player to recover. But I think definitely that focus between having a nice spread of being able to have an ideal week and, you're training loads across that week, but then you're just purely focusing on that next match and that recovery time.
Interesting. Anything to add, Mathieu, from a football point of view, with how you juggle the 1 game per week versus 2 games per week? I'm guessing 2 games per week is pretty normal for you guys.
Yeah, we don't have many 1 game per week situation. We are most of our let's say weekly schedule is between 2 and 3 games per week sometimes, especially with the COVID right now when we have to run after the games. But I think Martin dive a lot in that area of how we are training, periodizing the training. So it's mainly recovering, top-ups for the players that are missing some game times, and then training for the kind of main training of the week. Can be strength or high intensity, depending on what you need, and then picking for games. So it's super simple stuff, but it's mainly managing this kind of. We have 2 days of recovery, 3 days to prepare for the next game, or 4 days, and just managing this. That is a day-to-day business of the practitioner. So yeah, that's it.
The top-ups side of things. Now, come back to you, Amber, for this, if that's all right.
Yeah.
For those that don't play or get limited minutes, what kind of methods are you using to top up? And that's something that comes up all the time and has come up in these questions from attendees as well. What are you looking for in terms of aims for those guys? How are you going about that? Is it small-sided games? Is it purely running-based activities? How do you guys manage that?
Yeah, so I think, again, talking from my prior soccer experience, where I guess you do have those players who are on a bench that might not come in for a game, and depending on whether you've got a second tier, whether you've got a youth program or a second tier where they can play some match time, some of them don't. The things that we would do is, if they hadn't made the squad, it was giving them additional training stimulus before the match, or as Matthew said, it's those runs after a game where you are just trying to increase their load. It's really, really hard with particular athletes to try and actually, one, get them to do it, and two, have that kind of, I guess, mental stimulus to want to push and want to have that intensity. But I always thought it was something really important, and I'd always try and get those players up to somewhere comparable, because again, you never know, the next week they might be required, you might get an injury in your team, so it's crucial to keep those topped up. But I guess it was giving them some additional stimulus on a match day -1 session, whether they do an additional set of games as well at the end when your main squad who are going to play on that weekend come out. So that was one way that I've done it previously, and then some top-up runs at the end. But I guess with AFL, normally there is that luxury of having the VFL program, so your players who aren't getting selected are going to play the next day. But again, from this last year just gone, we were organising kind of intra-club games for those carryover players. So again, it was trying to keep those players topped up, keep them going with some sort of match stimulus that we could. But you kind of do rely on those top-up runs and those top-up games just to keep them up to that level.
Would there be some percentages of certain metrics that you would look for as a cap, or would it be like standard runs to get to a certain point? How would that look?
So just from my experience, and again, Matthew might do something different with PSG, but from my experience, it was a bit of both. So I would look at and work with the team, the S&C coach and the high performance director, and look at how their weekly load was tracking going into that game, and then sort of what metrics they were low on, whether it was just a volume thing, whether we did need to get some speed runs, and it would be purely, you do the volume based stuff, and then it might be 2 or 3 efforts at the end to get you that speed top up. So for me, it was always looking at that combination and what kind of do we need to get out of those runs. Is it just purely get their volume up? Have they ticked off enough speed during the week? Or was it then they had to do some additional speed runs at the end? So Matthew might use a slightly different approach, but that's just the way that I'd operated and I'd done previous.
Anything to add?
No, I think we have more or less the same process. So basically for us, it was depending on the coaching philosophy for our day+1, but day+1 is mainly small side games. Then depending on the number of players you have and what you can do, you have more or less big small side games. So based on the small side game we've done, if it was we have few players, we were small side games, we try to top up the day+1 with some high speed drills. If it was big small side game and we have enough in the bank in terms of high intensity and high speed, we try to top up with some more strength oriented skills. But then planning the day+1 depend on what you have on day+2, day+3, and what you have before. So if you have a player that played something like 6 games in a row, the day+1 won't be the same as a kind of a classic subs. So there is mainly variables and contextual variables that you need to take into account to plan the day+1. So it's kind of versatile, and we need to be quite agile, and that's why it's good to have a good overview of what the kind of the rooster for the day+1 did in the previous days or weeks, and to have in mind what is coming forward. So do we have big games, and the guys that are training on the day+1 will have to play soon or not? So based on that, it's come to the fitness coach to plan the good one. But
anything to add, Aaron?
These guys have got it covered, right, Rob? Oh, I'm pretty redundant here. No, I think they've got it. You really need to have a training plan. And if you've got a training plan, like it's more complex than giving a few measures, but you know what you've done, know what you plan to do. If individual data, and we historically have used a few blunt measures of total distance, maybe some speed exposure, high speed running, and some intensity. But there's no magic formula here, right? You're just using your best guess, really.
Yeah. But again, it's all come to the process. You need to know that the day plus one is the station that is coming the more in the year. So you need to have a good process in place to take the good action and plan the good training, because it's one of the, I won't say most important, but it's kind of one of the critical one in your year. And so it's offer a lot of window of opportunity for good trainings and so on. So yeah, you need to have a good process in mind.
Mm-hmm. Amber, just going back to you. Oh, go on, Aaron. Go on.
So just on that, I think with some early work we did, and others have done too, that window after a game, like you've got to be really careful not to expose athletes to too much, particularly that 24-hour window. It can interfere with recovery processes, and that affects what happens next. It amplifies the damage, and you've got to be really careful. I think that's where athletes can be, if they're sensitive to load, if there's such a thing, and I hate saying things like that, but that's where they can be sensitive and vulnerable, at least.
Cool.
I agree. And sorry, I was just going to say, like, I have always tried to top them up, like on the night of the game or prior to the game. I think it's a bit too much to try and expect then the player to come in when the rest of the group's recovering to then do extra work. I've tried to always, be in environments where it's steer clear of that. Hey.
Mm-hmm. Just staying with you, Amber. One topic that came up in a particular episode of the podcast, and it was a guy at Aston Villa, and it was around multi-mechanical modelling. And I had a little bit of a conversation with Martin actually on this post that episode, and I think them two caught up and had a little chat. Is that something that you've utilised? I mean, I think Martin's thoughts around it, that it seemed a little bit too simple. But is there have you have any thoughts on it? Have you utilised it? Yeah, what's your thoughts around multi-mechanical modelling?
Yeah, maybe Matthew's a better one. He's sort of doing some reactions down there. I might deflate to him. But from my understanding, I haven't really touched on that. I think my biggest understanding is giving the athlete exposure to their requirements of match intensity. So again, you profile your athletes, you begin to understand who your higher speed athletes are, and it's ensuring that they're getting that stimulus going into a game, that they're prepped for that. But in terms of, I'll be completely honest, in terms of putting that in an equation or something like that, I haven't explored that, no. So maybe Mathieu might shed a bit more light, having worked with Martin. So I think cool. He's
I know I won't make myself much friend with this opinion, but now to be honest, I just personally not a big fan of this model. So it's more or less as kind of the hype of mechanical metabolic power, and this kind of stuff. I think people are trying to look for stuff to reduce the complexity of training around two numbers. One is volume, one is intensity, and then I can put this into my kind of nice graph, and it's super simple. But one thing we need to think about as well. So we went in the kind of horizontal specificity, and we have on one side neuromuscular, high speed running and high intensity running and all this kind of stuff. So it's not about overall volume of overall intensity, but what I want to know is what is my volume of high speed, what is my volume of neuromuscular constraint, what is my volume of high speed running. This is one thing, and that and the second part is that at the end we need to remind ourselves that we need to speak with the coaching staff, so that the coaching staff will act on that. And I don't see myself just going in the changing room and telling my coach that, hey coach, you need to improve the volume by 0.2 on a 1 to 5 scale for tomorrow, but the intensity need to be reduced by 0.3. It will say, oh, what the fuck? what do we, come on, what do I need to do do you want me to do more, I don't know, small side games to have more neuromuscular constraints or things like that? And if I say, I don't know, I just want you to reduce the volume by 0.2 on my 1 to 5 scale, it's not gonna happen, to be honest. So I think we need to keep in mind that we are here to help the coach plan the training and the fitness coach plan the training. And so for that, we need to give them some insights and help them to understand that, okay, do I need to add more neuromuscular constraint? Am I missing some very high speed running or things like that? So we need to speak their language. And so it's not by trying to complexify the data process to super simplify the training periodization that we manage to do that. Mm-hmm. So that's why we stick to things that are on the field since kind of 10 years, and we are speaking about fast I'm running, what is the number of acceleration I've done. It's super simple, but we clearly see where we have been high in numbers and low in numbers. So.
And also, rather than talking about the goal, the outcome measure, give them, what type of training drills that they use could be selected to achieve that goal, because that's what coach speak is. So that's why you've really got to know training and how they plan training and the drills that they design. So I think that's really important. Rather than giving the number of our outcome variables, talking the language and how they prescribe it.
Yeah, I'd completely agree. And I think as Pacey said earlier, it's all about giving that feedback of the plan session versus actual, and it's like, did it achieve those goals? And as you just said, highlighting what drills are going to achieve that overall volume intensity, and having a good database set up to be able to identify that for them and give them that feedback. And I think sometimes there's maybe a bit of like a draw to have this magic number, this magic training load number, where I think it's more important to understand, well, did the session achieve what it was designed to do, and within that have the individual athletes achieved what they need to be prepared for the next training session or the next game. I think those two are your key metrics. And I think sometimes we get stuck in this world of trying to have this magic outcome, this magic number, but realistically it's like you just got to keep those things simple.
Cool. I'm going to come to you, Aaron, because we've got half an hour left, and up pops the acute chronic ratio.
Of course, magic numbers is what I heard.
What's your thoughts? And again, it was one that came up a couple of times, whether it, based on what we've seen in research over the last couple of years, does it still have a place? And if so, where? And if not, why?
Well, with being serious, I think change in training load has a place, right? Control of training load and changing training load, understand that training load changes has a place. But the acute to chronic workflow, as it's been presented, I know it's pretty clear the show that's been debunked. If you can read the recent paper in Sports Medicine that Franco and Palazzeri led that we put together, it clearly shows that a ratio score by itself, just the mathematical use of a ratio score, limits its applicability, and therefore it shouldn't be used as if you're trying to relate it to injuries. But that aside, so the ratio score and the flaw of the mathematics aside, controlling dose is important. But if we think that we can predict a performance outcome, or we think with high precision or an injury, I'm yet to see it, and I don't think I'll ever see it. And if I did see it and could happen, I'd be a very rich man. So I don't think so. I think the load control is a really important message that underlies behind that. But we need to not look for simple metrics. It's very attractive. And I admit, when I first saw it, this looks nice, right? It makes my job easy. But our jobs aren't easy. They're complex. Training is complex. And that's why we have undergraduate, postgraduate degrees and 10 years of experience at least, so you can do this job properly. You need to understand the complexity of it, and let's not go looking for oversimplified solutions. So the answer, in short, is that the acute to chronic ratio itself is flawed if predicting injury, but understanding load control is really important, and being able to do that, which is part of any good training system, it's essential.
Mathieu?
To be honest, I think we with the ratio, we fooled ourselves with that. To be honest, we are a lot that dive into the concept of, okay, we have this ratio, I need to track this ratio. Yet from day one, I remember all my talk with Martin and Ben about that. We never used as the kind of prediction number. It was more a way for us to use it as a nice way to visualize the training dynamics. So it's been done for ages. We didn't invent nothing. I think if we are back to the 60, it was more or less the same thing. Practitioners were looking at what did I do over the last weeks, 2, 3, 4, 5, depending on your sport and your context. What did I do during the last days? It can be 3 to 5 for us because we have super short training cycles. It can be 7 or 8 for sport like rugby, whatever. But the idea is to have a nice way to look at the trends of both and try to not create big imbalances. But yeah, so personally, I would continue to track these variables and try to display in the most compelling way for my practitioner, because it's a nice way to look at the dynamics. But again, if you want to, let's say, prevent injury, or better to predict injuries, just we are on the other side. It comes to the art experience of the fitness coach and what you are doing on training, what is the overall context, and it's way more complex than just playing with 2 numbers. And to be honest, would be too nice to say, hey, we as a community, we managed to predict rare events that are injuries. When people are trying to predict earthquakes on the planet, we way more data than we have. So we just need to be careful with that.
Anything to add, Amber? Are you guys still using it at all?
No, like I completely agree with the way of visualizing each individual athlete's distribution of data. As Aaron and Mathieu said, I've personally utilized that more effectively, and I think that that's really crucial. And again, looking at also the exposure, particularly the speed exposure and how many days since they've had that kind of last exposure to speed, I think is really crucial, particularly in a sport like AFL. The role that having that speed exposure plays, with your hamstring groups as an example. So I think looking at that distribution, as I said, looking at the load distribution, I don't think you can classify that in a ratio or in a number or in a certain band, and each individual is going to be different. Each athlete is going to be able to tolerate load differently, and each athlete is going to need a slightly variable loading and need exposures to different loads. So I think to have a blanket ratio or a blanket number, I don't think it's as simple. It would be, as both of them have said, it would be lovely, but it's not as simple as a one model fits all either.
Mm-hmm. Just on that speed exposures, Amber, is there any particular number of times per week that you would ensure that your guys hit above a certain percentage of their max speed? And does that differ between individuals?
Yeah, I think again in the preseason we have sort of 2 main training sessions where we're wanting to promote that speed exposure. In season, you're probably looking at in AFL 1 main training session where you would get that, but I would always try and ensure that your players are getting that. And previously in soccer as well, I've tried to promote that at least that they're getting that 90% plus, and the same in AFL across your training week before going into a game. Because again, I think there's been some good research that's come out and looked at the impact of having that speed exposure and, potentially helping the player going into the game. So I think that that's really beneficial to make sure that they are hitting that at least once during the week before they go into a game.
Cool. Mathieu, I'm going to come to you, but I'm going to come to you back to you, Amber, because you've got tons of experience in this as well. But monitoring neuromuscular fatigue or function with regards to assessments of that, Mathieu, and it was again taken from some of the questions that came in. Taken from some of the questions that came in. So I'd love to get your opinion on this because of the research and obviously the day-to-day working that you do in this area.
It's great to have this topic coming in a, let's say, external training load monitoring topic, because you know my opinion about that is monitoring external training load per se is not enough. You need to understand from a kind of just planning point of view, when I'm applying an external load, what are the responses to that load? And it's kind of the trade-off between one and the other that will allow us to just improve the way we train. So coming back to this, we test many things over the last few years. One of the first things we tried to dive in was the box-to-box standardized run. It was super simple. Players are just running 80 meters at a speed of 22 kilometers per hour. Again, depending on your sport, you can adapt this, but the thing is you need to have let's say a proper speed to have the more reliable and sensitive data. We've done a study about that with Cédric Leduc, who was in Leeds with rugby union players. We test multiple speeds, and if the speed is not high enough, the reliability is not good enough. So you need to have a proper speed. So this is good. We found a large relationship with left stiffness. So basically what we are doing is we look at sort of ratio, coming back to ratio, but of velocity, speed or velocity load, whatever your metrics, on top of vertical acceleration measured by the accelerometer. And using this metric and tracking this, we find a large relationship between this and leg stiffness, a good sensitivity, and let's say moderate reliability. So it's okay to use, but you need to use it on a regular basis and look at trends to understand if your players are coping with the load and are, let's say, fresh on a neuromuscular function perspective. The other thing we tried to dive in, and thanks Amber, it was an amazing paper. It was a standardized small side games, which is, let's say, the grail because it's fully invisible. You know, box to box, you need to ask your player to run for 3 minutes per week if you have if you want to put this in place. Standardized small side games, it's fully invisible, so it's clearly the grail. But the thing is, it's a bit more noisy, and again, it depends on a lot of contextual variables. Coming back to Amber papers, they managed to have exactly the same small side games at the same day of the week, was day -1 if I remember well, and they track the numbers like that. And maybe I think Amber we live in that topic in depth, but they were looking again at mechanical load or accelerometer based variables. We try to develop more or less a similar model, but the thing is we have many changing small side games. So what we try to do is to develop a model using what we call a readiness measure. The idea was, let's say, quite simple. We were looking at each specific small side games, and we were trying to compare the standard deviation of a player compared with the median of the team, saying that, okay, I don't know, if we play all the 4 we are doing the small side games, maybe Aaron will run the most, Amber straight on, I'll be the last, but Rob, you'll be you'll be somewhere in between. And if I can track this number over time, and you start to come to me more often, and then at one time you are running less than me, maybe it's meaning that that you are kind of tired on the neuromuscular perspective, or not tired but not fresh enough. We tried to do that, was looking super nice in theory, but it revealed to be super noisy on a day-to-day basis. So we were running the numbers, we were doing the reports, we were looking at it every day, and not much was showing off. So we dropped this one, but to be honest, I'd be happy to put my nose back into it with maybe more clever people than I am to look at different way to analyze this. The last thing we try to dive in. So it's what JB Morin is doing right now with the in situ force velocity profiling. We recently demonstrated that GPS looks accurate enough to compute the profile from the GPS. So you don't need now a radar gun and stuff like that. And so based on that, using all the training data, we should be able to track the sprint profile. And now we need to understand that to what extent fatigue or neuromuscular function alteration could lead to change in this profile. So maybe we can have something on the acceleration area, or maybe some change on the high speed area. But one more time, I think there is no one goal number or one goal test. But the more we can collect data, the more info we can have. Then if we can manage to develop 2, 3, or 4 good neuromuscular function assessments, saying that it's the more invisible, the better, because the less burden. And coming back, I guess Aaron will dive into that on the kind of cost benefits of doing this kind of stuff. But if we can manage to develop 2 or 3 tests like that, we should be able to look at trend. And again, it's going to be the trend that will help us to act on the numbers on a daily basis.
Come to you in a second, Amber, but Aaron?
I was going to say it's super attractive, and I've been doing this for over 25 years, trying to find these sub-maximal tests, non-invasive, invisible tests, where you get some external workload that's fixed. You look at a physiological response and a fatigue response at the same time. Like, it makes sense. It's logical, but geez, it's hard to do in practice. I've been lucky enough to work in some great places with really good control, and even there, the good control doesn't last for long. Football, professional sport environments are chaos, and they're really attractive ideas, but I've never been able to deliver it other than for research purposes consistently in the field. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't stop trying, but I think everybody who's listening should be aware that you do a lot of work here for little return, and you've got to be really aware of that before you go in. The cost benefit and the feasibility of doing these things, super attractive. Like all 3 of us are sold on it, but being able to get it to work is so difficult. So just be aware of that.
Over to you, Amber.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I guess was fortunate enough to, as Matthew said, be able to publish a paper and look at it across the season, and got very fortunate with being able to have a standardized drill performed every week with the same amount of players. But as Aaron just said then, it is very hard to do. I think it's definitely something that, and I myself would love to explore further as well in AFL, and it's that whole understanding of, like, we know that fatigue impacts their movement pattern. So it's like, how do you assess that? How do you determine that? How can you utilize something that you're already collecting to kind of identify that? But as Aaron said, it's extremely hard. It's extremely hard, and it takes consistency. It takes work. It takes something that's very precise, which doesn't always happen in a sporting world. And no matter how much you try and control for that, things just don't happen. So I think it's definitely an area that I want to keep looking more into, and talking to other experts and seeing what they're doing, talking to Matthew, seeing what he's doing with his force velocity profiling, and seeing if there is some way of exploring that further, for sure. But I think it's a work in progress. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we should also understand, is fatigue bad? And I think sometimes we measure fatigue, but we've got to understand, is fatigue bad, or is that actually what we want? And how much is enough? And we still don't know this necessarily. We've got some rules of thumb, of course. We can see outliers, but we also we need to keep our eye on the big picture here.
For sure. And I think, as you said, Aaron, like, fatigue is definitely part of the process. So I guess it's like, when's it occurring? How much is it occurring? And what implications is it having? Is it, happening early in the week when they've had that heavy game load, they've had that heavy training load, and we want them to then adapt to that, to then perform better in the consequential game? I'm getting tongue-tied here. The next game is what I'll say. Oh gosh, I got myself tongue-tied. Or is it happening leading into that game, which is actually going to impact them in that game? So I guess it's also about understanding when it's hitting them across that week and when they've recovered, which was something that, I was super keen to explore that kind of time course as well.
Mathieu, anything to add?
I like the way that it's a two-axis equation. On one side, it's workload of the game, it's the fatigue occurring, and how intense, or if I can say it like that, but the fatigue is, and then the decision making should be different. But I think we, as Aaron said, we try to see the fatigue as a no-go zone, never be fatigued. And I think again we misfool a bit ourselves, and I think that we need to try to, let's say, change a bit the paradigm and say maybe early in the week fatigue is good, and I can try to increase that fatigue if I know that on game day the player will be fully recovered. But yeah, fatigue is part of the process. Without fatigue, you don't have any adaptation. So trying to avoid by any means a fatigue is not the best things to do.
Mm-hmm. Just one last thing on this area, Mathieu, and it was planning based on post-match fatigue monitoring. Is that something that you can give us a bit of an insight into?
Huge topic, but I think depend of the period of the season, depend of who is in that state and when you are playing. But overall, so coming back to my previous point, we always complain about we don't have any window of opportunities to train. That's what we are saying. So I would see monitoring in the other way, saying, okay, maybe monitoring can help us to detect players that have fully recovered from games earlier than in the past, or earlier than planned. And so we have a new window to train. So maybe, I don't know, the guy playing he played the full game. We are going through the monitoring. The player is fully recovered and it was not planned. So maybe we can put some more load on him. So to expect in the long run to have adaptation. And I think it's the way to go to be sure that over 11-month season, we manage to have at the kind of sometimes small windows of opportunities that are opening, so we can retrain the guys, and in the end, we can manage to have a decent workload on a week-to-week basis, or at least a month-to-month basis. But for too many times, we've seen the monitoring as, okay, we will remove players from the training plan, rather than, hey, maybe this and this, we could put you on more load. So yes, and then again, coming back to what I would, just the cost benefit of monitoring must be super careful wasted. So there is a lot of factors when we are planning for that, such as, I don't know, logistical burden, coach buy-in, player compliance. So, and there is on the other side, sort of lack of evidence showing that incomplete recovery at kind of, I don't know, day +2 will negatively influence the ensuring performance. So I will be super careful when removing players from the training plan based on that solely, because on one side they are missing a technical session, they are missing a tactical session, and I don't know, maybe the 2 or 3% of recovery I'm managing for my player at the end as a higher cost than the kind of the full session of tactical knowledge he missed. So that's why to be honest, I'm trying to dive as much as I can into this kind of invisible monitoring, look at trends. So I try to remove as much burden as I can from the day-to-day operations. But yeah, we need to understand from research, likely, what are the direct relationship between 5% decrease in I don't know, neuromuscular freshness and a performance coming 2 or 3 days later, especially in football, when you know that technical skills are way more important than the overall physical stuff. So to me, super complex. Again, I know that, and I've gone in that area for many years, building kind of EV setup to monitor the players. I'm just thinking, okay, a lot of work. But to be honest, I didn't know if the few percent I was managing at the beginning of the week had an impact in the end. So we need to clearly remind that our goal is to have an impact on the game day performance, and so we need to manage that. Well, I understand I didn't answer the question at all. I put this here, and good luck.
That's fine. Anything to add, guys? Because if not, we'll dive into some questions. But Amber, yeah.
Just want to add, like, I think it's also important also to understand like the athlete's response as well, because I think sometimes we try so much to kind of control that, but it's also, that's where you can get other external metrics like their wellness, or just having those conversations with them as how they're feeling after a game, how they've recovered. I think you can't like undervalue that impact as well, and that conversation too, because I think as much as we can try and, I guess, look for numbers and look for data and look for information, like, they are people, and hopefully you can build that rapport to have that relationship with your athlete, that they're going to give you feedback, they're going to let you know how they're feeling, they're going to let you know what areas are sore and things like that. So I think we can't also, ignore that side of it too.
Were you going to add anything there, Aaron?
No, I got it covered. Only thing, I'll go back to basics. So whatever you measure, make sure it's valid, it's reliable, and it's sensitive, and it fits within a framework. There are no single answers to this. It is very complex. But even we talk about fatigue, we could get into what is fatigue, and that's another whole podcast for us, right? So we won't get to that.
Cool. We'll dive into some of the questions just for the next 5 minutes. One that came in, and I'll leave this up to the floor, so whoever unmutes the mic first, hopefully someone does. But regarding accelerations and deceleration monitoring, would you guys look at acceleration counts or distance covered during those accels and decels? Anyone? Shall I come to and drop it on someone?
Rob, there's no real answer. There's no one answer for this. It
Cool.
depends on what your target is, right? So it depends. And so I don't think we can say there is one to choose. It depends upon context. And I know it's a cop out of an answer, but it's a truth. Yep. You really need to know what the context and what you're targeting. So if you're trying to accelerate regularly, or do you want to train the process of more acceleration load on your muscular system, it really depends.
Yep.
And I can add one, and is, are you looking at the impulse? So taking into account the peak intensity of the acceleration, and so you have a third layer. And as Aaron said, depending on the context, you need to use one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next question. Just another few minutes. This was directed at you, Mathieu, but good to get the opinion of the other guys as well. In a 1 game week, how do you distribute volume of high-speed run and sprint distance across the different training days relative to match day?
Good one. We to be honest, again, there is no magic answer. To be honest, I won't give numbers, or I won't give examples, because I went through many different coaching philosophies right now, and depending on the coaching philosophies, the planning can be different. And to be honest, I don't know if there is one that's better than the other. It's just about how you are planning for it, and what is the end goal of that. But one thing I know is that you don't need to go flat through the week. You need to have some variability in training, and you need to have intensity at one time. I believe a lot in going through intensity rather than volume, at least in my sport. But then, depend on the context, coaching philosophy, and how do you plan the training?
Mm-hmm. Anything to add in your context, Amber?
No, I just agree with what Matthew said in terms of it's dependent on the periodization and the model. Like I've worked across, competitions in 3 different areas, and I've worked with numerous head coaches, and they've all had a slightly different variation. So in an A league, it was main training was done across, your volume was done across 2 days, and then went to MLS, and it was a completely different model. You're looking at like a tactical periodization. So you're looking at different stimulus across different days. So I guess it just is that conversation with your high performance manager, or having that plan and then understanding. And then in the AFL, it's been completely different again. So you're looking at just different sports, different models, different philosophies. But I agree, you as long as you have that kind of variability in your load across the week and you're hitting those different targets.
Cool. Last one from your fellow countryman, Mathieu, from Cedric. What do you think about peak demands? I love Cedric's questions. Always drops in the chat. Any opinion there? Mathieu? Sorry, mate. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
That was...
No problem. You could have sent this one by WhatsApp and
take it offline. Take it offline.
Yeah. Big hype of peak demands, but to be honest, I think it's a great addition to our tools. It's not the one go tools, but I think it adds to the tools we have to understand the intensity of the skills we are creating or putting on the field. One thing I'm super interested right now is that we have the peak demands, but what is the quantity? Coming back to the volume side of this kind of peak demands we are doing, because if we are just following the model, you just need to go in the zone once, and if you are just looking at that, did I reach these peak demands? You went once in your kind of peak demand zone, but what is the distribution of the demands? It's way more interesting, and trying to have some kind of matching in distribution of peak demands. It's way more interesting rather than just did I went there once, to be honest. Because, for example, I can run as fast as Martin Bichette, for example, but I won't run. I won't cope with the demands at all, So we need to be careful with that.
Aaron,
also say be very careful with planning training around peak demands of external load, because it's the internal load or the physiological adaptations that provide, that support that. So it's a really limited view that only using peak demands to plan your training. Like it's a tool, as Matthew says, it's definitely an important tool, but you need to plan your training to hit the physiological targets that underpin the ability to complete those. So we've got to get back to basics. And not let the external load measures take us away from the training process. It's all about preparing the body to cope with those, and it's just not as simple as replicating something that happens once in a game. It's much more complex than that.